Britain, at any given time in 2025, is one wrong move, is one moment away from racial riots.
Some members of the far right, the same people who inspired the Southport riots, they were frothing at the mouth. They were waiting for this information to come out.
This is a sovereign country, and I am the sovereign. I am the head of state. So, Donald, back off. It's not going to become the 51st state of the United States of America.
The 53-year-old white British man from the Liverpool area was arrested. We believe him to be the driver of the vehicle. Extensive inquiries are ongoing to establish the circumstances leading up to the collision, and it is vital that people do not speculate or spread misinformation on social media. I know that people will understandably be concerned by what has happened tonight. What I can tell you is that we believe this to be an isolated incident, and we are not currently looking for anyone else in relation to it. The incident is not being treated as terrorism.
That is Jenny Sims, the Assistant Chief Constable of Merseyside Police, last night, barely 4 hours after the incident where someone drove into a crowd of Liverpool supporters. It's hard to exaggerate just how exceptional it is for that detail to be given so quickly about an incident. A 53-year-old white British man. The police seem to have learned their lesson from what happened in Southport and the riots that ensued.
But what does it say about Britain in 2025 that the police feel compelled to release the ethnicity of a suspect in an incident like this? Are they simply running from the far right and the toxin they've injected into our politics? Welcome to the News Agents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And I've been watching the parade of Liverpool fans celebrating winning the Premier League, and it all seemed incredibly joyous. And then in a moment, the mood changed just after 6 o'clock, around 6 o'clock. A man in a car drives into a crowd of people, reverses, drives again, and you think, what on earth is unfolding? And of course, a number of people have been injured. A number of children have been injured, some of them seriously. A major incident was declared.
Yeah, and look, it is, given the nature of what happened, and there was a lot of very graphic social media footage out there. If any of you have seen it, you'll know what I mean when I say that I think it is nothing short of a minor miracle that no one was killed, at least not immediately last night. But 27 people were taken to hospital for treatment, 2, including 1 child, seriously injured, another 20 people treated for injuries at the scene. But what was so striking, and I'm sure probably you listening to this probably also had that sharp intake of breath when you heard what had happened, because such is a state, and so charged perhaps is the politics of Britain, and racial politics as well in Britain in 2025, that part of you, when you hear something like that, doesn't just think about what had happened, but you wonder about why it's happened and the circumstances and what could flow from it if it were to be a terrorist incident, and so on. As we say, the police have said that they're not treating it as a terror incident. And what was remarkable is that within hours, the police had made, in a modern period, a pretty much taken an unprecedented step in releasing the ethnic details of the man they thought was responsible, the suspect involved, a 53-year-old white man who was arrested at the scene. As I say, this was highly unusual and clearly had taken place in the shadow of what happened in Southport roughly this time last year. Our colleague from Global, LBC's crime correspondent Andy Hughes, is here just to give us a sense, just a breakdown of why the police might have done what they did. Andy, how unusual is that?
There's no doubt about it. It's massively, massively quick. It's certainly in my time, 20 years as a crime journalist, I can't really remember a time where such information about the suspect, ethnicity, has been pumped out like this so quickly. Certainly not in modern policing. Now, just to give a bit of context on this, back in the 80s and 90s, police forces used to do this regularly, but only really about black and minority and Asian suspects. They never really did it for white suspects. So in the post 9/11 world and after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, police forces moved on and they stopped doing that.
So they stopped doing it because it was basically racist, or they were accused of being racist?
Yes, because the minority groups were saying that by naming our ethnicity, you are therefore criminalising us and criminalising our race.
So we've had what happened late yesterday afternoon. How long have the police wanted to do this?
I mean, they've been wanting to do this for years. For context, I spoke to Neil Basu, the ex-head of counterterrorism policing in the UK, and he told me that when he was in post in 2016, 17, 18, him and the current Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, they were pushing for this, for more information to get out there and to get out quicker, because they wanted to nip it in the butt, because speculation is dangerous. It's dangerous for policing. It's dangerous for communities, especially in this modern world.
I just wonder, when I was at journalism college in the early 80s, that's when the new contempt of court rules came in. It's just not fit for purpose as a law in a social media age where everyone has got a smartphone, everyone is on social media. The idea that you don't say anything about the person or anything about the crime until such times as charges are brought, until such times as there is a first court appearance, just all seems irrelevant now.
Every copper I speak to thinks this is the right thing to do. They all say that by doing this, they have prevented serious disorder. They say there's absolutely no doubt about it, that there would have been riots. If this was allowed to linger and people allowed to speculate, then this would have resulted in serious disorder.
And not just speculate, right? Actively, because we saw this, before they actually clarified who it was. Already social media, and in particular on one social media site, IEX, was already flooded with that sort of innuendo, speculation, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, right? So their argument would be that they had to do it because if they didn't do it, there would have been violence.
Let's get this right. Some members of the far right, the same people who inspired the Southport riots, they were frothing at the mouth. They were waiting for this information to come out. And then when the information wasn't the stuff that they wanted it to be, even then they still tried to deny it. They said this is a PR campaign. So even the facts were there, they still weren't having it.
So I wonder, and this is the kind of counterfactual in all of this, what if the suspect yesterday was a 23-year-old Somali Muslim asylum seeker? Would the police have been as quick to give out that information, given how incendiary potentially that would be, or would they kind of try and mask it? Because presumably that's, if we're talking about the lessons from Southport, it is, what do you do?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it, John? And that was the first question that came to my mind. What are they going to do if it was an asylum seeker, 24-year-old asylum seeker? So because they've now set a precedent, they have now created a problem for themselves in a way. So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens next time.
So we've had what happened late yesterday afternoon. How long have the police wanted to do this?
I mean, they've been wanting to do this for years. For context, I spoke to Neil Basu, the ex-head of counterterrorism policing in the UK, and he told me that when he was in post in 2016, 17, 18, him and the current Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, they were pushing for this, for more information to get out there and to get out quicker, because they wanted to nip it in the butt. Because speculation is dangerous. It's dangerous for policing. It's dangerous for communities, especially in this modern world.
Andy Hughes, thanks very much indeed. Lewis, you said in the introduction to Andy, there was that kind of hold your breath moment when you read about it and think, geez, is this a repeat of what we've seen happen in Germany a number of times? What's happened in France, all sorts of other places as well, where, people use a car as a terrorist weapon. And I thought, oh my God, no. There were those on the far right, and I'm not asserting this, you could see it on Twitter, who were clearly hoping, yes, oh, well, it's a kind of Islamic extremist again, etc., etc.
They said it almost immediately. Andy
Yes.
was right to use frothing at the mouth. I think is not an exaggeration.
And it's just bizarre, the kind of hope that this kind of will prove their narrative, that there is this force within our society that is so toxic that they need to be challenged. It was really unspeakable, as if, we can have another Southport. Happy days. And you just think, what have we become? that people are thinking in those terms and sort of faintly disappointed, slightly disbelieving, wanting to think it's a conspiracy theory when people say, you know what, it's not. It's a 53-year-old white bloke from Liverpool who's the main suspect.
Yeah, look, I think it speaks to just how normalised and mainstream a lot of these far-right tropes and ideas have become. And a lot of that is as a result of Musk's takeover of Twitter, becoming X, and the normalisation of this sort of invective and fear-mongering. Merseyside police, within, half an hour, had issued a statement saying, urging people not to speculate as to the motives of the attacker, that obviously there could be no good which comes of that, and misinformation spreads online like wildfire. Well, some hope, because the usual pack of grifters who we have become accustomed to having a far too outsized influence and voice in our politics, as you say, John, and as Andy was saying, were already out in force. I'm not going to name them because they don't deserve any more acclaim or credit than they already get. But, one very well-known person with a big following later deleted a tweet saying, "This is horrendous. Everyone knows what's gone on. When will it stop?" Prayer emoji. That's the point. No one knew what had gone on. No one knew what had gone on apart from the suspect involved and perhaps the people immediately around them at the time. But it did not stop any of these people from taking to Twitter and maybe not always explicitly saying, oh, this was a Muslim or this was a young black guy or whatever it happened to be. But as I say, the kind of innuendo, the nudge, when will it stop? That was the kind of overall tone. And why are they doing it? Well, because I don't use the word ill-advisedly. They are grifters. They are people who are grifting off tension, off racial charge, mainly for commercial reasons, because it benefits them. It gives them a voice, it gives them influence, very often it gives them money. And such is the nature of the modern media ecosystem now, particularly with Twitter and X, that there is no stopping that sort of toxin, far-right tropes and ideas becoming more and more prominent. And leave aside even the far-right element of it, just the pure sense of misinformation. I don't know, we've talked on the show before about how difficult that is and how difficult it is to put the genie back in the bottle. But frankly, we know, right? We know that if it had been a young Muslim or an asylum seeker or whatever it happened to be, we know there probably would have been violence because we played this story out before. We saw it in Southport. And that is precisely what the police, they were obviously cognizant of that. And that is exactly what they were trying to avoid.
Well, you just cast your mind back to Southport. And I remember Farage releasing that video as what is it that police aren't telling us? Sowing suspicion in people's minds that there was much more to it than meets the eye. And as we have found out, the person who carried out the Southport killings was a deeply evil and troubled human being, but he was not Muslim, he was not an asylum seeker, he'd been in the country for a while, and yet people who should know better were going on X to say, oh well, more to this than meets the eye, I bet it's a wrong one, I bet he's a troublemaker, I bet we'll find out which religion he's from.
And these people, by the way, sorry to interrupt, John, but
Yeah.
these people have the gall, right, to attack the MSM for spreading misinformation, for spreading lies, all of this sort of stuff. These people hide in plain sight. Like, God knows, we both know, we talked about it on the show, the quote-unquote mainstream media has got its problems and flaws and has done for many years. No one from any reputable broadcaster, let's just take the broadcasters for example, would ever do the sort of thing that we saw last night. Never. Because there is a sense of professionalism and a sense of actually wanting to impart accurate and truthful information at all times wherever we can. Yeah, of course, make mistakes, but never knowingly. I mean, that sort of lies, that sort of nonsense would never occur.
I raised it with Andy as a question about, where does this leave the 1982 Contempt of Court Act? And quite often on this podcast, when we're doing a recording and, someone has been arrested or someone has been charged, there is a debate about what can we say? What is, what are the limits of what we can say and what we can't say without falling foul of the law? And on X, you have open speculation with total disregard to that law. And the contempt of court laws are designed so that when a suspect who's been charged comes to trial, there can be a fair trial. And yet, it seems to me that it is such a redundant piece of legislation now in so many ways, because the mainstream media are not the only means by which people find out information. And I think the police have got a devil of a job, and lawmakers have got a devil of a job to work out how on earth you deliver fair justice, which everyone has got an interest in, when there are these grifters. And you talked about the profit motive. If it was only the profit motive that was driving them, you'd think, well, geez, okay, they're trying to make some money. It's not very pretty, but at least they are driven by politics. They are driven by
radicalisation.
The radicalisation. They want to sow discontent. They want to see riots on the streets. They want to see mosques burning. They want to see fires, cars aflame. That is their interest. And that was the interest of those people in Southport. And thank God Merseyside Police did do what they did yesterday. But as we discussed with Andy, it raises a difficult question in future. If someone fitting their preferred profile, i.e. a kind of Islamic asylum seeker, is arrested.
And honestly, these grifters have got the biggest cheek imaginable, right? They then, of course, as soon as the police issue this statement, which takes the wind out of their sails, at least to some extent, what's their next line? Well, it's two-tier policing. This obsession that they've got that policing in Britain is deeply racialised, right? Yes, they had a different standard this time. They did something different than in Southport. Why? Because of people like you.
Because of what happened in Southport.
Because people like you fanned the flames of racial and cultural division to such an extent that it resulted very often, nearly entirely on the basis of lies and misinformation, resulted in violence which lasted for days and days across England. And that is why they've done what they've done, is to try and prevent that from seeing that vacuum filled with those lies again, which could result in violence. So if there is two-tier policing in Britain, or if there is a different standard, I don't like that phrase because there isn't, but if there is a different standard being applied in this case, it's because of you. You have created the different standard. All of these people filling their Twitter timelines and whatever with absolute nonsense and lies here, there and everywhere. So look unto yourself if you're wondering why the police are having to change the way they do things.
You also mentioned earlier on Elon Musk and what he's done to X and what's happened to Twitter in the intervening period. I mean, let us not forget that after Southport last year, Elon Musk was busy tweeting about civil war was coming to Britain. It had started
liar
the
in
civil,
chief.
and it was absolutely extraordinary that someone who has, in the past year, look at the position he's held as at the absolute heart of the Trump administration, was prepared to put out totally unfounded stuff and almost inciting, almost wanting, again, use that word, salivating at the prospect that this could be unfolding in Britain. And it's so wide of the mark. And so, kudos to Merseyside Police for the way you've handled this one.
Although, I mean, what's disturbing about it, right? What's disturbing about it is precisely the fact that they felt compelled to put that information out there, right? Merseyside Police have obviously taken the calculation that, frankly, Britain, at any given time in 2025, is one wrong move, is one moment away from racial riots. Now, you can say that we've had racial riots throughout our history, they have come and gone, but we've never had this sewer of misinformation and so many actors with such a large number of platforms who clearly, as you say, John, who clearly, for whatever reason, are agitating it for it to happen. The agitators for these sorts of things in the past tended to be, fringe figures, people very much on the extremes of politics who did not have an easy recourse to followers and to getting their message out to people. That is clearly no longer the case. So it is deeply disturbing that in 2025, the police felt compelled to put this information out there, so worried lest what might happen next. But also, I mean, if you're an Asian person or you're a black person in Britain today, it's not a very comfortable message either. That basically, what the police were basically doing, in a sense you could interpret it as, is stand down everybody, don't worry, it's a white person. Obviously, that's not what they were doing, and that's not what it meant. But I can totally understand how it was internalised. Likewise, you do see some of this misinformation and this kind of deeply racialised kind of critique of policing come from the left as well. Because you saw some accounts on the left last night saying things like, oh, right, okay, so it's only terrorism when a brown person does it or when a black person does it or whatever. And it's like, well, no. terrorism has a particular definition, right?
Yeah.
It's not about him being white. It's not about, in the same way with Rudy Kobane, it wasn't about the fact that he was an ethnic minority. It was about the agenda. It's about the intent. It's about whether there was a political motive. And clearly in this case, the police, for now at least, believe there wasn't. And so this, as I say, I mean, the police, they have their faults, but it is an absolute nightmare navigating their way through this sort of thing at the moment.
And the other thing that's changed so much, I mean, you talked about sort of, there have been race riots before, and you think of Toxteth, and you think of the Tottenham riots, Brixton, all the rest of it. And I covered some of those. And the fact of the matter was that the far right was this sort of kind of skinhead rump that didn't have much organisation. They didn't have much financial support. They didn't have the means of communication that they do today. And it was kind of, I remember outside a prison in Winchester, there was anti-Nazi League protests in the 1970s, I think it was, of what was going on then. And the fact of the matter was, they were just tiny numbers there. That tweet you read out that was later deleted was from someone who has, I think over 1 million followers.
Huge following.
Huge following. And reaches a huge number of people very, very quickly. And the radicalisation, the number of people who are prepared to get involved in a fight over this is really, really terrifying. And thank God it wasn't anything. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible event in and of itself. But thank God it wasn't what those people wanted it to be.
And the reason there's so many of these people are frankly disappointed this morning. And by the way, what's especially appalling about that is there wasn't barely even a moment online from some of these people when they were actually thinking about the victims. At that time, we thought, it could be mass casualty events. Barely a moment before we moved, or those people moved instantly to the political agenda. The reason they do that is because their entire critique of Britain, or their political critique of Britain, is basically that Britain, as it's currently constituted, is unstable because, and let's be honest, they're mainly talking about Muslims here, because Muslims are basically a kind of enemy within. They're a fifth column. They talk in these terms. These aren't my terms. This is the way that they talk. That there is a basic incompatibility between Islam and British culture, and therefore Islamism, the political form of Islam, will be everywhere. That is why when they see an attack like this, they instantly leap upon it, because it is a vindication of their worldview and their critique, and they cannot deal with and handle the fact when it isn't. Now, that's not to say, of course, that we don't have an Islamist problem in Britain, that there aren't problems around this. We've seen that play before. It's also true in continental Europe. This is something that many Western European states are grappling with. But it is not the case, and it is clearly not the case, that there is a fundamental incompatibility between being Muslim and being British. There are millions of British Muslims who are law-abiding, who are as British as you and I are, and live in peace with everybody else. As I say, it's not to minimise the extent of the problem, but these people take that problem, they extrapolate it onto all Muslims for their own political agenda. And that is why, when we see things like this, they leap upon it so aggressively.
And it wasn't that long ago that you and I did a podcast on a speech made by the former Home Secretary, no less, Suella Braverman, when she was in America and made claims about the Islamification of Britain, and that there would soon be a majority and Sharia law would be coming to this country, and kind of almost weighing in behind J.D. Vance on, Britain will become the first Islamist nuclear power.
Well, she said it was something worth discussing. She didn't agree with it, I think, but,
no,
it was
worth
worth discussing.
What happens if the UK falls into the hands of Muslim fundamentalism? Our legal system gets substituted by Sharia law, and our nuclear capabilities vest in a regime not dissimilar to that of Iran today. Regardless of whether one thinks this is a realistic outcome, which I do not, should we not have the courage to ask these questions and look at where our country is heading?
The levels of immigration there would have to be of Muslims coming into this country for it to become a majority is just ridiculous. The Muslim community represents 6% of the population in the UK currently. They are not a majority. They are not going to become a majority. And yet when you get mainstream politicians kind of flirting with the ideas of it, pandering slightly to those far right sentiments, I think it's a very dangerous place, and those politicians need to be looking at themselves long and hard. And in a moment, we'll be looking at the King in Canada, the significance of him going for such a short time, and also what it means for our relations with Donald Trump.
Today, Canada faces another critical moment. Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear, and ones which the government is determined to protect.
The King is in Canada, in Ottawa, to open the Parliament. And that is something the British monarch doesn't do every day. Last happened in 1977 when the Queen was on the throne.
How was it reporting from that?
Yeah, it was great, actually. Yeah,
good,
I
I
was
bet.
doing my A-levels at the time, I think, so I wasn't doing that much reporting. But anyway, we will move on. But look, here we have the King, who is being treated for cancer, travelling to Canada for 24 hours. And you can bet your bottom dollar.
Is that all it is? I didn't even realise.
Yeah.
24 hours. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And that you can be sure his doctor said, this is a bloody stupid idea. Of course you shouldn't be going to Canada for 24 hours. But the diplomatic and the political importance and the symbolism of the King going to Canada, just north of the US border, to say, you know what, this is a sovereign country and I am the sovereign, I am the head of state, so Donald, back off. It's not going to become the 51st state of the United States of America.
That's mad. Couldn't they have made a week out of it, the two of them?
But
A
I
nice
think,
break?
I mean, presumably, this has been shoehorned into the diary
Yeah.
as a result of all the other stuff that Donald Trump has said, and the feeling. And you can be sure that the King is not going to be as crude as I've just been to say, back off, Donald. Canada's not going to become the 51st state. But that is the intention. Very quiet, very silkily, to just make it absolutely clear that Canada is not for sale.
Well, it has been a very unusual period for the Crown, for the royal family, because it's been, and we probably haven't really had anything like this, certainly since the war, that I can think of in a major way, where the kind of tension that the Crown has between being the head of state in the United Kingdom and the head of state in another major realm that the King has, in this case Canada, has actually potentially the interest been rather at variance, right? Because you can imagine, and again, the King's private office having to try and sort of navigate this. I'm sure when you were there, John, when I was there recently, I was reading some of the Canadian press, you sort of got this sense, which is that there have been Canadians expressing dissatisfaction with the fact that their head of state, i.e. the King, has not been more vocal in combating the claims of another head of state, in this case of the United States, that he would quite like to be the head of state of Canada, right? That would be something you would imagine that a head of state, even in a non-political head of state, party political head of state, might do. But clearly the United Kingdom, for which of course he's also the King, has been at pains to try and keep relations between the UK and Trump as close as possible, and indeed have not just dangled, but made the prospect of an official invitation from the King for a state visit. So this has clearly been a bit of a delicate dance for the royal family to try and perform in a way that they have not really had to do in recent times, because when have the interests of the UK and Canada vis-a-vis the United States been substantially different? Virtually never.
Well, if you look at the history since the Second World War, when most of the globe was painted pink for the British Empire, the narrative has been of countries wanting to assert their sovereignty, of decolonisation, of trying to kind of establish themselves, moving away from the Commonwealth with the King or the Queen as head of state to being their own independent republics. I mean, most recently, Barbados saying, right, look, thank you very much, we'll stay part of the Commonwealth, but we're going to have our own head of state here, not as head of state in London. And here we have a sort of almost reverse dynamic of the Canadians saying, well, hang on, you are the head of state,
Yeah.
Mr. King Charles. Could you come and speak
Mr.
up
King,
a bit?
I like that.
Yeah,
I think they call him Mr. King.
Mr. King Charles
Yeah, yeah.
is exactly how they would address him. No, it's not. But this is exactly what I think the Canadian people want. Of course, Charles is not going to do it in a performative way in the way that Mark Carney was doing in a general election campaign, but by dint of him being there, he is planting the Union Jack very firmly in Canadian soil as well as the maple leaf flag, and it's not going to be the Stars and Stripes anytime soon while this king is on the throne.
Well, it was very striking, wasn't it, during the election campaign when Carney started to talk about the links between Canada and Britain. even referring to it as British in a sense. You have not had this for a very, very long time. I mean, Canada took off the Union Jack from its flag, in the post-war period. This is a country which, as you say, has been in many ways moving away from, and this kind of weird dynamic of moving back to is genuinely new, and it's very interesting.
And it's very interesting when you consider Trump, who doesn't respect institutions at all. I mean, he trashes all, we were just talking a moment ago, Lewis, before we were recording, about what's happening to Harvard University and Donald Trump's moves there. You listen to him talking about the courts, hear him talking about Congress. Donald Trump is not an institutionalist, but the one institution that he really does seem to respect is the British monarchy. Whoever is their sovereign, whoever is the king.
It's the only group that has more gold than him.
Yeah, exactly. Or who is the Queen, and he loves all of that. And so it was very interesting. This weekend I've been talking to various people kind of around the royal household about the...
You and I have very different weekends,
Yeah, well, you were in Swanage, I saw.
Exactly. There were very few royals down there.
Yeah. So anyway, about what's going to happen, about the state visit, which still has not got a date penciled in. And the thing I heard was this kind of intriguing idea that it might just never happen. Now, Donald Trump wants to come to Scotland this summer for the opening of his new golf course, of course.
Even more important than a state visit.
18 holes, links in Aberdeen. It looks fabulous.
He's going to be here for that. He's going to take
He was here the day after
sojourn.
Brexit to go and see Tony.
I know, but he wasn't president then, was he?
Well, he was the candidate.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
he just
that's
got the
true.
nomination, and he was. Not many people take time out on the campaign trail to do a business trip. Donald Trump did, and he's coming again. So what you could do this summer is maybe in August, when the King is at Balmoral, you host a big dinner for the president when he's come over to see his golf course.
That. All the kilts and everything.
All the kilts, all the bagpipes, this, etc. You can imagine
He didn't
it
get
all.
that last time.
But it's not a state visit. It's just he happens to be in the country. I'll have him round for dinner on Saturday night at Balmoral, and we'll invite a few people round. It will be a bit of a knees up.
Has His Majesty not suffered enough?
So the other thing I was told is that they really enjoy Donald Trump's company. The
Oh,
King
really?
and the Queen. Yeah, apparently they find him immensely entertaining, great raconteur, storyteller, and they kind of like the role of quietly trying to just usher him into a different direction on certain policy positions, and think that is their role. And I think they kind of relish that particular role right now. So that would take care of this year of not having to have a state visit.
Yeah.
Next year, 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. The pressure
wait.
then will be on the King to go to Washington to mark, so 250 years since 1776, and so he
It's a
would.
bit rude. That
Well,
was his relative who
I
lost
know
America.
George III, but he made a few mistakes, did George III. So
yeah.
fair enough. So so that's next year. Year after that, do you really need to do that much? Because Donald Trump will
Presidential
be on his
election
way
on the way.
out. Presidential election coming. What can he do for Britain that would be a great favour when he's, at the tail end of his second term? And so kind of the idea just may be that the whole idea of a second state visit just withers on the vine and never actually takes place.
Well, I mean, it could be extremely useful for Keir Starmer and the British government if that were the case. Because for two reasons. One, there's a domestic political imperative, which is actually they are aware, particularly when Labour is polling so badly, that they are aware that, particularly actually increasingly the problem on the left, that any association with Trump, those pictures, as Theresa May found with Trump when he came for the first state visit, those pictures of the two of them being extremely pally, extremely close, would not be politically helpful for Starmer in any way. And that would even be the case if you're trying to court votes on the right, because one of the things that is remarkably, in a very fractured political world, actually there's a lot of consensus in all of the polling with the British public that most left to right don't like Trump. They find him uncouth, they find him boorish, they find him unpredictable, all those sort of things. But also as well because, what kind of reaction is he going to get for precisely those reasons? And we know this is a man who's extremely thin-skinned. There is a prospect, if there are the mass protests and whatever, that it's not exactly counterproductive, but Trump does take them to heart. So there will be nervousness, I think. So if that version of events that you were told sort of comes to pass, not entirely unhelpful for Starmer. And is telling that no date has transpired. It's been some time now since Starmer went to the Oval Office and offered it. No date.
Wouldn't it be the most perfect example of Britishness and the British way of doing things that we've spoken on the podcast a few times about? For goodness sake, couldn't Keir Starmer just stand up a bit more to Donald Trump? Couldn't he be a bit more like Mark Carney rather than what he is, which seems to be being rolled over.
Although you and I have generally thought, haven't we?
That he's played it
quite
absolutely
well.
cleverly.
Yeah.
But it would be the kind of supreme achievement of the quiet assuredness of British diplomacy that you offer a state visit that never actually happens. You've held out the hand of friendship, but you don't actually go the full hog of rolling out the red carpet and setting up the state banquet at Buckingham Palace for him. And, similarly, King Charles in Canada today, he's not going to say anything that's overtly critical of Donald Trump or the United States of America, but just quietly by being there, you are making a statement. And I think that's how Britain likes to think it operates.
There's also another element as well, if I were in number 10, I would worry about, which is that, obviously, the guy is completely quixotic and unpredictable. If you remember, people forget now because it's like basically feels like ancient political history. But I remember when he came over, because I remember reporting on it for Sky. I remember when he came over for the first state visit, it was all going really well and everything. And then it turned out that he'd done, and I'm not sure if number 10 were even aware of it, he'd done that interview with The Sun, right? Where, he'd basically slammed May in the way that she was handling Brexit and the Brexit deal. And then everything became about that. And, look at even the last 24 hours. Trump has said something about the Lucy Connelly case. This has become a bit of a cause célèbre on the right and indeed far right, to go back to our first discussion about this woman who has been imprisoned in Britain, or she received a prison sentence for incitement to violence during the Southport riots. There are people who believe that this verdict was too harsh. Many people would say it certainly wasn't, because of the sort of thing that she was inciting, albeit with a later deleted tweet. But, these are the sort of things that, as we've talked about many times on the show before, in this kind of sort of radical right extended ecosystem that there now is, a basically Anglo-American one, where, look, J.D. Vance or whatever will pick this stuff up, and then Trump will pick it up, and vice versa. It's a kind of goes back and forth. Who knows what sort of thing that he might pick up and say when he's over here. And then everything becomes about that, and Farage leaps on it, and so on. So, it is not without risk, that state visit, by any stretch of the imagination. I can see why they extended it, but it is not without risk.
We'll be back after this. So before we go, Lewis, I heard your interview on Friday with Jake Tapper in his new book about the demise, really, of Joe Biden. I'm now halfway through the book.
It's an extraordinary book.
It's devastating, isn't it? I mean, Jake Tapper says this isn't a book that is going to convince you that he was either totally unfit or totally fit. We're just trying to report what happened. Well, frankly, I'm 100 pages in. He was totally unfit to be president at the end, and certainly never fit enough to run again for a second term. And yet, somehow, it feels like in parts of America and here, it's blaming Jake Tapper for writing it and bringing it to public attention.
Yeah, Tapper and his co-author, Alex Thompson, are receiving opprobrium, particularly from all directions, because the right are criticising them for saying, and maybe there's some justification in this, but where were you at the time? Tapper, as people will have heard that interview, does wrestle with that and does address that, but that's the right. And then there is a left critique, which I had myself a sort of sense of over the weekend, a small sense of, because as always, we put clips from our interviews on social media, and I sort of tweet them out with a link to the podcast or the YouTube episode, and just sort of inundated with people, liberals, progressives, saying, why are you interviewing this guy? Calling him a grifter, calling him, saying that he's on the make, saying that you should be focusing on Trump. Now, listeners, viewers will, of course, perhaps think the newsagents that we have many faults. I think focusing on Donald Trump's inadequacies, or a lack of focus on those things, is probably not one of them. But what it sort of said to me is this is the perfect encapsulation of how we got here, of how the Democrats ended up in the absurdity, let's be honest, of putting Biden up again when he was manifestly unsuited to do so. Because everything is viewed through the hyperpolarization of the Trump-Biden, Republican-Democrat existential contest. Do not look, under any circumstances, at the faults of our guy, because to even do so is to risk catastrophe with the other side. Of course, the irony of that entire approach was to guarantee the catastrophe from their point of view in a Trump restoration, because refusing to wrestle with the clear problems with Biden by the time you get to, even before that debate of, middle of 2024, this time last year, was to basically avert your gaze, look away, when the focus should have been, and I can see why it didn't happen, but when the focus clearly should have been on whether the guy was fit to run till 2029, which we now know. I mean, look at his recent diagnosis. The idea of him being president till 2029 was then, and is even more now, risible.
I honestly, what you see is either the most concerted cover-up in history and the dissembling and downright lies of members of the Biden inner circle, because it was the inner circle around Biden, because I think those on the periphery just didn't see enough of Biden to ever know, because he did so few news conferences, he held so few cabinet meetings, he just didn't do very much because he was not capable of doing that much. They either lied through their teeth about him, or they just took the view, and these aren't mutually exclusive, that any means justify the ends. And we can do anything we like, because if it's in the name of beating Donald Trump, that is a price worth paying, and we'll live with our consciences. But I mean, I read the accounts of what some of these people did or did not say, or the way they shut down any debate or conversation about this. And you think, wow, I wonder what they're thinking to themselves now as they look at the carnage that has been left behind of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and people say, and I can understand why people say this, but I think it's deeply flawed, which is they say, well, look at Trump. They say he's senile, he's mad, he's deranged. Very often he does exhibit many of those traits. And they say he lies. And therefore, anything by comparison is irrelevant or immaterial or insubstantial. But the entire point, right, if you're setting yourself up, as we said this on the episode on Friday, but if you are setting yourself up as the alternative to Trump, and saying that he's the guy who lies, that he's the guy who covers things up, that he's a criminal. What you can't then do, right, is basically vindicate what Trump says, because Trump's entire analysis and critique of politics is all politicians are lying to you all of the time. Therefore, my brazen lies are less important, because at least in a weird sense, I'm more straightforward about them.
Yeah.
What the Biden court managed to do, and whether you call it a cover-up or a conspiracy, or certainly at the very least hiding his true condition from the public, which they clearly did. He didn't do a proper interview, for God's sake, for years, or proper press conference. Clearly, what they did was basically vindicate that analysis. And also, there are genuine points of where I think the Biden team, and the book does document this, behaved appallingly. Let me give one in terms of besmirching, doing exactly what Trump does in terms of lying about people and trying to destroy their reputation. One good example, the Robert Hur investigation.
Yeah.
The Robert Hur investigation, he was a special counsel appointed by Biden's own Department of Justice to investigate whether or not Biden, or whether Biden had broken the law by keeping a load of documents at his home after he left office as vice president. People might remember the Biden response to that and his team's response. It was to eviscerate Hur. It was to call him a partisan hack, right? They said he lied about whether the president had failed to remember what date his son Beau died. People remember Biden got up and said, how dare he say that? How dare he said that? We now have the transcripts. Indeed, we now have the audio from that. Hur was completely right. Biden brought that up himself. Hur didn't, and he didn't remember when Beau died. And yet the Biden administration, the people around Biden, went out and lied and basically defamed this guy, Hur, who never responded. He didn't even respond off the record. He acted with a lot of integrity because he said, this is what the Department of Justice does. If you are the guy who says, I'm on the side of the institutions, I'm on the side of the Constitution, I'm on the side of right versus wrong, you've got to behave that way. And in many of these instances, to try and protect Biden and his reputation, his team did not.
It was also at the same time as you have the Democratic Party or the Biden people acting as though they had the moral high
That's what
ground.
I mean. Exactly.
They do not have the moral high ground. Any suggestion that they have the moral high ground after what this book has detailed, and it is detailed, and huge numbers of people have spoken to contribute to this book, and no one has debunked it since its publication, show that they behaved in a pretty squalid and dishonest and disreputable manner to cover up for someone who just wasn't fit for office.
Well, good luck to our notifications on Twitter later. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.